I like my metal how I like my coffee. Black.
That's not black, but
There's definitely almond creamer in there. That's how I like my metal.
with a little
With
almond
a
cream.
little almond creamer.
But not too much.
Not too much.
Still pretty black.
Oh my gosh. Hi everyone. Welcome back to Arsenic and Espresso, our podcast series about metal music. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to our last episode.
You probably missed an episode.
You probably missed an episode. But we will be discussing genres of metal music. And we will be uploading them
Separately.
in segments.
Yeah.
In separate segments. So if you want to be able to listen to the whole thing all together at once, we will be uploading it as a full-length podcast. Anyway, next genre on the list that I'm talking about, at least, is black metal.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to talk about this because several of the bands that I listen to, I always say several, the one band that I listen to.
Well, the stuff that interests you.
The stuff that interests me.
Because, I mean, there's a lot of metal that you've listened to or have and you'll come back to.
Yeah.
But, I mean, even though you only have 2 or 3 bands that you keep on repeat.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of that stuff that interests you.
But so, yeah, many of the bands that interest me do fall under this category of black metal. But something that I didn't realize, I knew that there was this huge shift in the black metal world in Norway, I believe in the 90s. And I knew about that, but I didn't know much more. And so black metal kind of rose, or it came to the forefront in the 80s in England. And the term black metal was actually coined in 1982. A band called Venom, their second album was titled Black Metal. Yeah. And so this is where we start seeing that phrase used to describe a certain genre of metal music.
And I think they even had a song, right? That was a title song off of the album, too.
I believe so.
I'm pretty sure.
I don't know for sure. So, but this is where you also start to see a rise in bands performing in corpse paint. And you have kind of like that weird time in the U.S. when there was glam metal, but also heavy metal, and you had bands like Kiss performing in makeup. You had bands like Twisted Sister with pseudonames. That same thing was happening through Europe with black metal, except it was much darker, and it wasn't as like drag queen-esque, I suppose. Yeah. It was definitely intended to instill like some fear in the viewer.
I mean, it worked, right?
It did work.
Well, and I think for a lot of those reasons, anything on the blackened side of metal, I'm really interested in the culture behind it, more than I'm interested in the actual music of it.
The original black metal through the 80s, it pulled a lot of its inspiration, I suppose, from Satanism and paganism, mostly Satanism.
Yeah.
And many of the bands throughout had this very strong, just anti-religion tone to all of their music. Musically speaking, the singing was replaced with screaming. So musically speaking, singing was replaced with like a high-pitched screeching scream. Okay. And that became one of the main like defining factors of black metal. You had bands like Venom and Bathory and Merciful Fate, and this is all still through the 80s. You see the pseudonames and monikers replacing actual names, and band members becoming like only known by their pseudonyms. The sound had a very, very dark tone to it, very low, like lo-fi production quality, heavily distorted guitars, really fast drums, and you had that anti-religion, anti-church theme throughout all of the songs.
Yeah.
These black metal bands of the early 80s, they used the imagery of Satanism to instill a fear, but that was it. It was all imagery. It was all a show.
Yeah.
Right? It was all just like something to be scary, so they grabbed, threw 666 on everything. They put pentagrams on everything.
Well, and I feel like that's still relevant to today, right?
Yes.
There's a whole lot of bands out there that don't really have a Satanist sound or
Mm-hmm.
Satanist lyrics, save for a few of their songs or, one or two songs on each album. But that's not, you wouldn't think that from the album art, right? You'd think that that's exactly their entire lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just more on the play of this is scary and it's not Christian, right?
Yeah.
The anti-religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And however we can make ourselves look anti-religion, that's what we're going to do. And so then in the late 80s, so we're still talking in Europe through Britain and like Norway and Germany and all of that. So in the late 80s, you have black metal kind of falling to the back burner, and you have death metal rising in popularity. And the difference between the two, black metal had that really high pitch, really fast paced, and death metal had this lower pitch vocal. You have like not slower beats, but just
is toned down
heavier.
though.
Yeah, it's a lot more toned down.
A little sludgier sounding.
Yeah, slowed down with a higher production quality.
Yeah.
And so you had those two like very different genres kind of coexisting at the same time. And then in the 90s, so this is the part that I knew happened. I didn't realize the extent of this shift. So in the 90s, there was this second wave of black metal that came through. It stemmed from Norway specifically. And you had bands like Immortal, Mayhem, and Gorgoroth. And they took that fear. They take that fear of Satan and Satanism in general, and they amplify it. So through the 80s in the United States, there was this satanic panic going on. People were really afraid of cults. There was a huge rise in the satanic church and devil worshiping, and you started to see, you saw murders, you saw mutilations, you saw, what's the word I'm looking for? Like arsons, all done in the name of Satan. And when it turns out a lot of those people who were doing those horrible things weren't actually a part of the satanic church, they were just doing it to instill fear. So through the 80s, that's happening in the United States. And then this second wave of black metal comes through, and they really take kind of that satanic panic fear and really amplify it. And then from 1992 to 1996, there were over 50 Christian churches that were burned with ties to black metal.
Oh, okay.
And it started, so like it wasn't the bands going out and doing this, but it was like their followers, and it was like the cult following that compounded behind these bands. And like the youth of the time took these lyrics from these songs and put them into practice.
Okay.
Right. And then in 1991, so like there was black metal, and then this second wave of black metal was like, no, we're going to be more hardcore. Like, you think you're hardcore, like, you don't even know.
You're not hardcore unless you live hardcore.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. In 1991, Mayhem's vocalist, I'm going to butcher his name, Per Ingray Olin, committed suicide. He killed himself. He slit his wrist, he slit his own throat, and then he shot himself in the head. It was a horrible, horrible thing, and a very violent suicide. Yeah. The lead guitarist from their band is the one who found him, and instead of going for the police, he went down the street, bought a disposable camera, and took pictures of the crime scene. He took pictures of his friend's suicide, and then later they used one of the pictures for an album cover.
That's hardcore.
And I looked at the photo they used as album cover, and it's horrific.
Terrible, yeah.
Because like, it's not just horrific because it's a dead body, but it's horrific because this person killed themselves in such a violent way.
Yeah.
And then was exploited. Yeah. Right. And so like, that to me, I don't understand.
I feel like that second wave, right? That first wave is, a lot of their stuff was based on the Satanism and anti-religion and all that sort of stuff, like you were saying. But that second wave is just, they just wanted to up it, right? Up the ante more. And what else can we get away with? What else can we do to prove?
Yeah. And how scared can we make everyone?
How dark and how,
And I feel like it sort of became this thing, this like battle of the bands, if you will, of like who could be more fucked up. Yeah. Like who could do something worse than the other person. Yeah. And it got really, really dark for a really long time. But then there was this unusual like mainstream rise of black metal. As this was happening, black metal rose in popularity.
Who pushed
among
it?
The masses. I mean, bands like Mayhem, bands like Immortal. Yeah. And then there was one band in particular, I think I wrote it down, Dimmu Borgir. They were one of the most successful black metal bands. So I don't know if they were the ones who were pushing the rise in popularity or if they were pushing this extremist lifestyle.
But either way, it all worked in their favor.
It all started to rise in popularity. It did become more mainstream. And I think a lot of bands felt like that defeated the purpose of black metal. Right. It wasn't supposed to be mainstream. It was supposed to be something that was dark, that was secluded, that was almost like a cult. Even though it was anti-religion, it started to form this almost religious following of its own. Yeah. And then rising in popularity, bands were like, what is this? Like, this isn't what we signed up for. This is not what we're about. And the mainstream started to eliminate that fear tied to black metal. Because it rose in popularity, people were like, oh, it's so creepy and fun. Like, this is crazy and it's so spooky. And it took the fear away and it made it like a haunted house, I feel. Like, that's the only way I can think to describe it, is people looked at it like a haunted house. So even though
it was normalized in a way.
It was completely normalized. And so, like, even though there were bands who were like, there were people like committing murder, who were committing arson, who were like photographing their dead friends and using it as album art, the masses were like, that's so creepy and weird and we love it. Yeah. But I feel like it eliminated the fear that is so often associated with all kinds of metal. Because I know, like, as I've listened through some stuff, as we've started doing some research, like, I know I don't listen to the heaviest stuff out there at all. Yeah. And I acknowledge that I don't listen to the heaviest stuff. And I've had people tell me, like, your music sounds so scary. And I, like, in my brain, like, I'm like, but you haven't heard.
You have no idea.
You have no idea. My stuff is like cupcakes compared to some of this, you know? And so with that rise in popularity, many black metal bands shifted to other genres, kind of leaving behind that violent and satanic imagery. Yeah. Because murder is not marketable. Like, simply put, arson is not marketable. So bands, they shifted their sound.
There's not a long-term success plan in arson and murder.
Exactly. Yeah. You can only go so far before it's prison. Right. But then you had, so for an example of a band who shifted their sound, you had Immortal, who then created a completely fictional world that they based all of their lyrics off of. And they said, no, it's not satanic. Neat. It's this fictional world called Blashiker that all of their music was based off of. And then you had that band that I was saying a minute ago, Dimmu Borgir. I tried looking up pronunciation, and Google was like, we don't know what you're talking about. So I apologize, because I know I'm saying it wrong.
Probably. That's okay.
I don't speak Norwegian. What do they speak in Norway? Is it Norwegian?
It's Norwegian.
I don't speak Norwegian.
Yeah.
But so Dimmu Borgir, they added clean vocals. So you had that layering of the really dirty vocals with clean melodic vocals. And then they also added that operatic element. So you had more of those classical instruments come in. Oh, that's cool. You had that rise in like that like Sabaton sound. Yeah. Where it's very orchestral. Yeah. In addition to heavy drums and distorted guitars, right?
Yeah. That makes it fun to listen to, I feel.
I love that. Yeah. And this is where you see the rise in like, and the transition into these bands having more of like a folklore, nature, more like traditional pagan
Right. Was that
undertone.
okay? Yeah, I was gonna say, is that where like the focus in like Celtic metal and stuff like that
Yes,
started to
and
come
that
through?
like
Or
Viking metal.
yeah,
And so you have bands pulling from like folklore, but like mythology. You have
Yeah.
bands pulling from mythology. You have bands like Immortal creating worlds of their own to base their lyrics off of. And for example, you had, and this is all still in the 90s, so you had the band Agalok adding unconventional instruments, which led to a very folk metal sound. And then at first it didn't get popular, and people were like, why is there a banjo? Like, what are you doing? I don't understand. But then in 2007, French metal band called Alceste used more of those traditional and unconventional instruments in their debut album, Souvenirs d'un autre monde. I don't speak French either, so I apologize. And people loved it. They really ate it up. But this is where you have that huge split, and you had black metal being an umbrella for all of these other genres, like symphonic black metal, melodic black metal, blackened black metal, progressive, atmospheric, depressive, psychedelic, and even unblack metal, which was from the Christian world.
Oh, interesting.
A movement to like counteract
so it's
that satanic
same
black
sound,
metal.
just different.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and it's funny to me because we're talking in the mid 90s.
Crosses right side up.
And that's when, but that's when there was that huge rise in Christian metal in the United States.
Yep.
And
yeah, that's
so
where it
I
all...
think it's very interesting that around the same time frame on both sides of the world, you had this rise of these other genres, specifically Christian metal, being like, we want to be a part of this too.
Right.
Like, we like to headbang too.
We can make music. Yeah.
But I feel like of all the genres, black metal begs the question of, is it metal enough? Are you even hardcore?
Yeah.
Like,
right. How heavy
and if
can
we
you get?
Compare,
how dark can you get?
How dark can you get? Like, I feel like if you compare other genres to what black metal was founded on, the answer is no. It is not metal enough, because traditional black metal bands were constantly one-upping each other.
Well, and that's
and
where you get
themselves.
like Ozzy biting the head off of a bat.
100%.
Right? I mean, that's what that whole movement was about.
Yes. And it was all about instilling that fear and just being as extreme as possible.
Yeah. All aboard
and then
the crazy
also
train.
The question is, with this huge shift away from violence and actual like law-breaking acts,
right.
Does modern day black metal even exist? Or
like, is it all just
can it exist without the fear and the violence that started the genre?
Right.
Right. I don't think so, because you don't have, I think you can have elements of traditional black metal from the 80s in your music. I think bands do have that, but again, murder is not marketable.
Probably a lot of bands that take a lot from black metal are influenced a lot by black metal, but not.
But no one is performing human sacrifices at their concerts,
which I'm okay with.
Yeah, as a consumer,
less human sacrifice, less churches burning, I think is a good thing.
It's a good thing for everyone, all around. Bands that I personally love that fall under this like new black metal sound, Equilibrium, who I've talked about a couple of times. Yeah. They fall under that symphonic folk black metal and the melodic black metal. And then a band called Falkenbach. They're German, and they are black metal and Viking metal, which I love me some Viking metal. I love it.
Viking metal is fun. I think that actually reminds me, I was just listening to a breakdown today talking about Igor, a band Igor or Igor. I don't, goes both ways, right?
It's Igor.
It's a Igor.
What hump? Name that movie.
Oh, I love that movie. But yeah, they actually have what did they use in one of their songs? Was accordion. They had an accordion going.
I love that.
With some like just really heavy metal sounding drums in the background and everything.
Well, freaking Equilibrium on their latest album Renegades, their song Moonlight has like a piccolo or
Yeah.
something in it, and
That was
it
cool.
is so weird.
It's just fun to listen to.
And it's so, well, because like 1 minute you're like in a mosh pit, and the next minute you're at a Renaissance fair, and I love that. And I know a lot of people don't.
Mhm.
I know.
But I feel like they do it sort of for music's sake, right?
Yeah.
And it's just them.
Well, and I also feel like, and I could be getting this wrong. Obviously, I'm not a member of this band, so I don't know for sure. But it's reaching back to your roots, your cultural roots of saying, like, this is where we came from, and we're going to apply it into our music today.
Yeah. So I think that kind of leads me into where the couple of genres that I wanted to talk about as well was that transition of the mainstream focus, right, in the 90s, basically. And the biggest focus in the 90s for the mainstream music.
Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Metal Genres. If you want to listen to the whole thing, again, you can find it on any podcasting network except Apple Music. It'll be there eventually. Find us also on Instagram and Twitter. Tune in next time for either another episode like this one or something new.
Something completely different.
One or the other.